Hello, and welcome to This Week in the Middle East with myself, Francis Matthew, and Eddie O'Sullivan. And this week we're joined by Chas Freeman, a very outspoken commentator, a man with great insight, who is a visiting scholar at Brown University in Rhode Island at the moment, but has had a long career in the American civil service with both the state and defense departments, holding senior posts in both. So we look forward to hearing what he thinks. Meanwhile, let's have some headlines.
In This Week in the Middle East, Hamas negotiators have begun intensified talks in Cairo about a possible Gaza truce. Turkey says it will not resume trade with Israel, worth $7 billion a year, until a permanent ceasefire and humanitarian aid are secured in Gaza. The US House of Representatives has voted to pass the bipartisan Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. Egypt's credit rating was raised to positive from stable by Fitch Ratings following a $35 billion investment deal with the UAE and additional support from the IMF. Abu Dhabi's Mubadala Capital plans to invest about $13.5 billion in a biofuels project in Brazil over the next decade, and ADNOC's production capacity has reached 4.85 million barrels a day, up from 4.65 million barrels a day reported at the end of 2023.
So there we have it, with the Hamas negotiation going on in Cairo, which we're recording, the talks are still underway. So let's bring in Eddie. Hello.
Hello, Francis.
And Chas Freeman, Ambassador, welcome to the show.
Thanks, glad to be here.
I wonder if I could plunge straight in and ask you to comment on the whether the American position whether there's a clear American position. I've been watching Secretary of State Blinken making several trips to the region and coming back with really very little. And I'm surprised that there's not much leadership emerging. I don't know how you see it.
Well, I don't think there's a strategy. I think there's a posture. It is largely for domestic political purposes, to appease donors to the Biden campaign, who are strong supporters of Israel. And I note that the focus of Mr. Blinken's travels to the region tends to be the Israeli hostages. Either that or the highly improbable project to normalize relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. I say highly improbable because I don't think that the basis for such an agreement existed even before October 7th, although the Saudis were prepared to deal transactionally with the Israelis. But certainly after October 7th and the subsequent genocide in Gaza, any possibility of rapprochement on an official level is gone. I know recently Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, said in an interview with Ed Luce of the Financial Times that there could be no defense pact with Saudi Arabia unless it recognized Israel. This obviously puts Israeli interests ahead of many other things, and he relegated the Palestinian issue to sort of third place in the three-way deal that he envisaged.
So at the moment, I'm reading of the Saudis have put forward a suggestion of what they're calling a plan B, a kind of a defense, perhaps nuclear deal, but leaving aside the Israelis. Do you think that's got any legs on it?
Well, Mr. Sullivan directly addressed that and said, no, that could not work.
Right.
I must say, from the very beginning, the improbable nature of this deal was apparent. There is absolutely no way that the United States Senate would approve a defense treaty with Saudi Arabia. There's absolutely no way that the United States Congress would approve the full nuclear fuel cycle for Saudi Arabia. And there is absolutely no way that Mr. Netanyahu's government would deal effectively with the Palestinian self-determination issue. which is the cause of all of the current distress in the region and most of the past distress as well.
Eddie, yeah.
Yes, Ambassador, you were ambassador to Saudi Arabia for a period. My impression with the Saudi Arabians, they're very, very cautious. Actually, they don't make big leaps in policy shifts, and partly because they're not a democracy. There's no elections you have to worry about, so they can take their time. And I've always had the view that the Saudi Arabians are going to be extremely reluctant to recognize Israel. I've often argued they would be the last people on the planet to do so, because other people would do it. Do you think anything has really changed fundamentally in that, with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman now basically running policy? I mean, I'm influenced by people like Turki Al Faisal and Saud Al Faisal that you knew, and they were very, very consistent and coherent in their position. Do you think Mohammed bin Salman has done anything really to deflect Saudi Arabia from what, in my opinion, have for many years, decades, been very clear?
Well, the constitution in Saudi Arabia, meaning the practical framework for governance, has been inverted. When I was there 30 years ago, it was a government based on shura, the Islamic concept of consultation, and no decisions were made without the achievement of a consensus. And the king had to consult widely, not just with the family, but with wealthy and poorer people, tribal elements in the kingdom, in order to make a decision. That's all gone. Mohammed bin Salman now has the authority to make decisions, and he does. But having said that, I would note that on two occasions, once at Fez in 1982, I believe, and again in Beirut, I think 2002, I can't remember the date, the Saudis did say that they would be the first to recognize Israel if it dealt with the question of Palestinian self-determination.
Yes.
And this was, of course, ignored by Israel, which has continued to expand its settlements and its grip on all of Palestine. So now we come to a point where the latest polls in Saudi Arabia show that 96% of Saudis believe that other countries that have relations with Israel should break them. This is not an auspicious finding in terms of Saudi normalization with Israel. And I agree with what I take to be your point, Eddie, and that is this is not going to happen.
Exactly. But do you believe that the White House or the present administration genuinely believes that it could happen in the way that they suppose? Or do you think that, again, it's just show, it's public relations, it's directed their donors to give the impression that they've actually got a plan when they don't?
Well, they seem to be capable of enormous reaches of wishful thinking. One can look at Ukraine, where Ukraine was going to defeat the Russians, and still may, they think, or claim they think. It's very hard for me to tell whether they are sincere in their delusions or whether they're just delusional. Could be either one.
And would that delusional state also apply to their current rediscovery of the two-state solution as a way forward?
Yes, that is remarkable. Of course, the two-state solution was a sort of magical incantation for years,
Correct.
Intended to ensure that there was no peace process, while pretending there was. So the rediscovery of it, under circumstances where I think it's essentially impossible,
Yes.
given the degree of land seizure in the occupied territories, not to mention what's been done to Gaza, I think it is a fraud under the current circumstances. But it is very definitely at play in Cairo. Hamas on several occasions has actually accepted the two-state solution. I think they would do so now if it were offered. But it's not being offered. What is being offered is a very limited period of tranquility to be followed by more fury and assassinations. I don't think that's very attractive. That's one reason there is very unlikely to be an effective deal for the release of the remaining Israeli hostages.
And how do you think, Chas, the United States and its Middle East policy can get from where it is now, and you said, well, either it's willfully or unconsciously delusional, to where you think it should be? How does that happen? Is that going to be the State Department, professionals exercising influence? Do you think it's going to be grassroots pressure? Do you think it's going to be the fact that, the Democrats could start losing votes and losing elections? What do you think needs to change in America to shift it in the direction that needs to go?
Well, at the moment, we're seeing the younger generation rise up in opposition to the traditional Israel first policy that the United States has followed. In due course, they will be in charge of the country. I think that will probably be too late to save either Israelis or Palestinians from what they are doing to each other. But change is coming. I might say here that one of the more interesting aspects of this is that the Israel-Palestine issue has become the test case for freedom of speech in my country. This is actually not anything new in a sense, in that the Israel lobby and the supporters of the Zionist experiment in Israel have been very effective in silencing critics and defaming them effectively, vilifying them, to the point where people have been intimidated and been silenced.
Yes.
That silence has ended. And the Congress, as the House of Representatives, as your headline indicated, has just passed a ridiculous bill equating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism and criminalizing expressions of either, which is totally at odds with our First Amendment freedoms. And of course, I would say in many ways, sadly, the experiment with the Republic that we began well over two centuries ago is coming to an end. Benjamin Franklin, as you may recall, when he came out of the Constitutional Convention, was asked what the result was, and he said, "A republic, if you can keep it." And I think we no longer are keeping it. I think we're seeing the collapse of our constitutional order, and the freedom of speech issue is a major element of that.
I noticed actually and I follow him a little bit. I mean, you may not regard his opinion worth listening to, but Judge Napolitano, who did specialize in constitutional law, I mean, he said, first of all, I mean, will he get through the Senate? He questions it. But anyway, it's unenforceable. Once it gets to the Supreme Court, it's going to get chucked out. So it's clearly outside what the Constitution of the First Amendment requires. But of course, that can only take place if an individual takes the case because they feel they suffered injury as a result of this legislation. So anyway, so I think it seems to be a very big issue. But then again, I mean, I'm asking, do you see any light at the end of the tunnel, or do you feel we're locked into this for a good long period?
I don't see it going away in the near term. And by the near term, I would say not just, through the November presidential election, but whoever's next in office. At this point, I believe that's most likely to be Mr. Trump, which is something that I contemplate with dismay, because in terms of the survival of the American Republic, that is probably the worst outcome one could have. Well, we'll see. There's a very interesting cartoon which I saw this morning, which said that Mr. Trump, if he's elected, will be America's first dictator. And it portrays him as Snoozolini, obviously a play on Mussolini. And in some ways, he does resemble Mussolini or Berlusconi, perhaps. And we are having a comic opera here instead of an election.
Yeah.
If I can twist us back, I mean, you remind me with Trump, his first term, he produced the Abraham Accords, And I'd be curious to know whether you think that the Abraham Accords, will survive, how they're working, and how you see that one going forward.
I'm very skeptical that they will survive because even though the United Arab Emirates is a supreme practitioner of realpolitik, they found it necessary to demand a halt to settlement activity, as well as all sorts of military goodies from the United States, which weren't delivered. There's been no halt to settlement activity, quite the opposite. And I imagine the Emirati population, although I've not seen polling data, probably has some of the same animosity toward Israel, given the genocide in Gaza that one sees elsewhere in the region. So I think these accords are on borrowed time. What has happened, to go back to what I think was going on between Saudi Arabia and Israel before October 7th, is a willingness to do transactions with Israel. So the Saudis invited the Minister of Tourism from Israel because they hope for many shekels to shower on Neom and the resorts that they're building at the head of the Red Sea. And I think the Emiratis are quite capable of doing what we're all going to have to learn to do in a world where if you're not with us, you're not necessarily against us on everything. You have to be, you have to differentiate between what is in your interest and what is not. And you may have a military confrontation going on, let's say the United States and China over Taiwan, but you may also have a vigorous economic relationship, or you may have a bad economic relationship and a good political relationship, and so forth. So we're coming into a world in which, rather like the 19th century of Europe, countries will be required to be flexible, pragmatic, and to not take across-the-board positions of enmity, friendship, or whatever. I think it was Palmerston who said that countries only have permanent interests, they don't have permanent friends. And I think this is correct.
You mentioned in this, one thing I want to draw on your insights about China and what China's intentions are in the Middle East region, because you've been following that quite closely in terms of what they declare and what they actually intend to do. How would you define it, from a Beijing point of view, when they look at what I assume they would call West Asia rather than the Middle East? I mean, what do they see? What do they see the opportunities and risks are? How do they distill that down?
Well, you've caused me to recall the answer my Thai teacher gave when I asked her what the difference between Thai people and Sino-Thai people, meaning Thai of Chinese origin, was. And she thought for about 2 seconds, and she said, very simple, Thai people like to buy things and Chinese people like to sell things. And I think when the Chinese look at the Middle East, they do so through a commercial lens, have no interest in doing what the UK or the United States did in the past, namely provide security guarantees or dictate policies. What they're interested in is oil supplies, gas supplies, markets, and I think they're doing quite well in that regard.
But the Chinese did get involved in negotiating the accord between the Iranians and the Saudis, perhaps because they wanted a more stable place from which they're going to buy their oil, or didn't that indicate a willingness to at least break what you've just said?
Well, I think the Chinese do have a great interest in stability in the region, grounded in their economic interests. They built on the prior mediation of Iraq and Oman to push a rapprochement quite effectively. The major merit they have is, in fact, that unlike Western countries, they talk to and maintain relations with everybody. So that when you have a problem between Iran and Saudi Arabia, or Saudi Arabia and Syria, or whatever, Turkey and another country, you can't get the help of the United States or the UK. You might get Russian help, but the Chinese are always there, willing to promote a stable environment in which their merchants can prosper. Now, I think there's one corrective to this. The Chinese have relied on the United States Navy to protect the supply line between the Strait of Hormuz and through the Strait of Malacca to China. They can no longer do so, since it's quite obvious that the only threat to commerce, freedom of navigation in the South China Sea and elsewhere, is the United States Navy in the event of a U.S.-China conflict. Chinese interest in freedom of navigation, by the way, should not be underestimated. 3/5 of the traffic in the South China Sea is going to or from China or on Chinese bottoms. So there are a lot of ridiculous things said, narratives imposed on reality. But I don't think when you look at the Middle East from a Chinese perspective, you see, I don't think they see it as a predator, which is what we tend to attribute to them. I think they're being pulled into the region and by commercial interests, by governments that would like them to offer security protection, which they won't give. They're quite happy to sell weapons. And more of that will be seen. They will be a competitor to the traditional suppliers, the United States, UK, France, and probably a very effective one, because technologically they're advancing very rapidly.
But they've also got a series of ports. You were saying that that huge proportion of shipping goes through there. That they have built that, what the Indians call the string of pearls, in Colombo, in Hambantota, in South Iran, even in Myanmar. The Chinese have got some ports which they manage and also give themselves naval bases there. So they are extending their naval stretch into the Middle East.
I think they manage Canary Wharf also, don't they?
And Piraeus as well in Greece.
Oh, sure. I mean, this is a country that has a global economic footprint. Now, by the way, the string of pearls was the invention of a consultant at Booz Allen Hamilton in Washington, D.C. There's never been a Chinese reference to this. And I think one thing that does distinguish the Chinese, perhaps, is, and maybe it's neocolonialist in a way, like the 19th century, great figures, Cecil Rhodes, for example, they don't do anything economically halfway. So we have bases in Djibouti, for example, but they would put a base in there and a railroad up to Addis Ababa, so that their port has an economic hinterland that makes it even commercially viable. We don't do that. We think purely in military terms. So I think it's easy to come up with hypotheses about malign Chinese behavior. But when you look more closely, you see self-interested behavior that is not irrational or even very menacing.
I'm struck by, of course, Andy Blinken's visit. And I'm rather down on American secretaries of state. I was always impressed by James Baker. I thought he was very effective getting the Madrid conference together. And what a shame that whole process was derailed. But looking, I don't want you to be, too personal with some secretaries of state, but it looks like Blinken's not having much luck with the Chinese. Is my impression correct?
Absolutely correct. He went to Beijing to have a meeting for the purpose of having a meeting and no other purpose. Let's not forget that the Biden administration's interaction with the Chinese, which began with a meeting in Anchorage, Alaska, was the scene where Blinken went in and said to the Chinese, you are moral reprobates. We are going to keep you down or push you back if we can, because you're so dreadful. But there are a few things we need you to do for us. Would you kindly do them? Now, this is the opposite of diplomacy. And I think Mr. Blinken betrays his background as a congressional staffer. So does Mr. Biden, in my view. And I will not exempt Mr. Sullivan. What do you do if you're in the Parliament, the Congress, the Senate? What you do is talk about foreign policy to the domestic audience. You're not actually doing foreign policy. You're manipulating domestic opinion in support or again in opposition to foreign policy. That is Mr. Blinken's skill set, learned in the Senate as a longtime loyal staffer to Joe Biden. That is Mr. Biden's skill set. Jake Sullivan is what my wife calls a campaign gerbil, meaning some sort of critter that gets in the straw and with other gerbils and vibrates in a nice way. He was campaign manager for Hillary Clinton.
Yeah.
He was her political advisor. His credentials as a strategic thinker are very bare or invisible.
Do you think there's any possibility that the tremendous professionalism which characterized the American Foreign Service for so many years and produced so many constructive results for the world as well as for America, do you think that there's any possibility that, you know, the highly qualified professionals with years of experience who've learned the languages and lived in the countries, who are dealing with realities, do you think there's any chance that the State Department professionals will once again be given the opportunity to exercise their skills? Or are we going to be forever in a situation on the foreign policy, at least the presentation of foreign policy in America, is going to be in the hands of basically lobbyists and political hacks?
Well, for the time being, that will remain the case. I would argue that my colleagues and I in the American diplomatic service, and I was a Cold Warrior. I retired a couple of years after the Cold War and went into business, and others did, that is, hang around Washington and pretend to be influential on policy. I tried to rectify my status as a church mouse, poor person, with some success. And I think our Foreign Service needs retraining, because a great deal of what we did in the Cold War was, to put it unkindly, imperial administration. And to put it on in a somewhat more favorable light, alliance management. But that is not the skill set that is required in a world with no center, with many regional frameworks, where the central institutions that a brilliant bunch of people created after World War II are all being superseded or sabotaged. Think about the World Trade Organization, for example, which the United States has deliberately sabotaged. So everybody but us is doing free trade agreements, and these agreements have within them dispute resolution mechanisms that substitute for the vanished role of the WTO. And one can go through, I think one of the great casualties of the war that Israel's conducting on the Palestinians is the United Nations, which has been shown to be utterly feckless. And I think many people are beginning to mutter, not speak very openly, about the need to do to the UN what we did to the League of Nations, namely replace it with a more effective body in a different system. Now, what that would look like, I don't know, but it certainly would not consist of the victors of World War II sitting, presiding over everyone else.
Well, maybe that's something you could put your mind to, Chas, and maybe you could
well,
make a few recommendations. The world needs it, Chas.
No, I think we all agree. on that, and the UN reform has come up a few times. If I can revolve us back from our tour around the world to the area we're talking about in the Middle East, one of the we touched on Iran sort of tangentially. What they call the axis of resistance, the Iranian allies, or sometimes they're called proxies or even friends. They all seem to have minds of their own. So I'm not so certain. You have some familiarity with Hezbollah and Hamas, at least, and I wondered how you see whether those actions are Iranian inspired, or whether Iran is following, or whether they're following their own trajectories from their own positions.
I would say these are clients of Iran. That is, they have a pragmatic relationship based on an exchange of favors, but these organizations have their own agency. They make their own decisions, and they're very different, the two that you mentioned. Hamas is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, and it is a democratic Islamist body. When you talk to senior leaders of Hamas, as I did some years ago, you're surprised to find that they believe in the ballot box as the source of power. And this is exactly the problem they have with the Gulf Arab so-called monarchies. They're not really monarchies in the European sense. That is to say, they say, I'm speaking of Hamas, they say, in the past, if you had a moral agenda in Arab politics, you had to rely upon a thug, a dictator, a general, a prince, a king, some sort of authoritarian figure, an autocrat. But we have shown that you can gain power at the ballot box. And these people are all now irrelevant. So if from the point of view of the Saudis or the Emiratis or others, you look at Hamas and you're horrified, because basically they're stating that you're entirely illegitimate. Same problem with Egypt's al-Sisi. So that's Hamas. Hamas is a democratic movement that grew a militia, which turned out to be far more effective on October 7 than anyone had imagined. Hezbollah is a militia which came into being as a result of Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon and Israeli depredations in Lebanon, and which later grew a political arm. I would describe Hezbollah as classic fascist in nature. That is to say, it provides a state within the state, welfare services for its constituents. If you get up at 1 o'clock in the morning in Beirut, you will find Hezbollah out cleaning the streets. It's not the Lebanese government that does that. And of course, when Israel attacks and slaughters people in Lebanon and destroys their housing, Hezbollah is able to turn to Iran for finance to make things right. So these are complicated relationships. Same thing's true, by the way, of the Houthis, who are the de facto government in much of Yemen. And they are their own agents. They have made a decision to conduct the first land-based sea blockade in the Red Sea. Something quite remarkable. Iran obviously has learned from this, which is why it took a ship in the Strait of Hormuz, just to make the point that what the Houthis can do, it can do better if it comes to that. So I think the relationships there are usually seriously misdescribed by the Western press, the media, the governments, because it's convenient for Israel to describe them that way. Otherwise, Iran used to be Israel's great friend.
Correct.
Because the enemy of Iran was the Arabs, and the enemy of Israel was the Arabs, and the enemy of my enemy is supposedly my friend. By the way, I don't think that equation works in the new circumstances. The enemy of my enemy may also be my friend on some matters and enemy on others.
This is as we move into the multipolar world globally, it's also happening in the Middle East.
I agree. And I actually prefer the word multinodal, because a node is a connection point in a network, and it's three-dimensional. You can have all kinds of connections, positive and negative, going through a node, whereas a pole is the end of an axis. And we have the North Pole, the South Pole. There's a line between them that goes through the center of the Earth. And I don't think that describes where we are. I think nodes are a better word, and I'm not waiting with bated breath to hear anyone pick that up. But I think it is an important distinction and a better description of where we are.
If I can ask a last point, we watched the Iranian-Israeli tit for tat with their missiles going backwards and forwards, and largely it seems to me that very little damage was done. So either they were operating very carefully, or by accident they seem to have managed to set the messaging rather than damage. But it certainly proved a point that Israel's defense and supremacy has been punctured, whether with Gulf intelligence, Jordanian support, some Western involvement. It didn't speak very well for Israel's military supremacy. I wondered how you see the outcome of those on both sides, both on the Israeli and the Iranian side.
Well, I recall that at least it is reported that before Iran conducted its retaliation for the bombing of its embassy in Damascus, it declared privately that if the Security Council condemned that action by Israel, it would not retaliate. But of course, the Security Council, meaning the United States, Britain, and France, vetoed the condemnation that I think was entirely appropriate. I'm afraid we've set a very bad precedent, and our own embassies will in future be in jeopardy. I note that the Ecuadorians seem to have been inspired to go into the Mexican embassy by this violation of international law. Anyway, I think what happened was the Iranians very deliberately focused not on doing damage, but on sending a message. And the message was 72 hours ahead, they told everyone, well, we're going to retaliate. They told people, well, we're not going to kill anybody, we think. They sent drones that took 4 or 5 hours to reach Israel, followed by cruise missiles timed to arrive at the same time, and ballistic missiles. Now, the interesting thing is the ballistic missiles struck very precisely at the targets that they were aimed at. One of them was the swimming pool at the officers' club in an Israeli air base in the Negev, from which it had launched the F-35s on Damascus and an outbuilding there. There were no attacks on populated areas, only on military bases. And by the way, one thing that this showed was that Israel, without the support of the United States Air Force, the Royal Air Force, and the French Air Force, cannot defend itself, even against this relatively mild messaging. If Iran were to do what it said it would do, if Israel retaliated, as it usually has, disproportionately, it said it would send 1,500 missiles, not 300, the next time. There's no way Israel would have been able to counter that, even if it had the support of the West. So one major development is that Israel has lost the sense of its right to carry out disproportional attacks with impunity. It is now restrained in a way that it never had been. And now there's some hotheads in this extremist cabinet in Israel who don't appear to recognize that. But it's very clear that the Israeli military, which is not stupid, understands very well what has happened. The second major development, I think, less noticed, is that the Iranians said to the Saudis, the Emiratis, and others, look, if you join in this thing on the Israeli side, you attack us, or you help the Americans to attack us, we will attack you. And the Emiratis, Saudis told the Americans, us, we will not allow you to attack Iran from our territory. With the result that aircraft are now being redeployed to Qatar, to Al Udeid Air Base there. But effectively, Iran has neutralized the American deployment in the Persian Gulf, because if the host countries won't permit it to be used, it can't be used. So this was, I think, on the Iranian side, very carefully considered, well executed, strategic gain. And I think it's put the Israelis in a hard position. It's put us in a hard position. It's not clear now what the purpose of all those troops sitting around the Persian Gulf is.
Very interesting. Ambassador, thank you. It's been a very interesting half hour. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Chas. Absolutely refreshing. Keep going on, Chas. Your voice is needed.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that and enjoyed the hour.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Well, a fascinating half hour. Now, you will have heard things there which you agree with, and you will have heard some things you might not agree with. And either way, please get in touch. Tell us what you think. And we'd like to hear from you. When we hear from you, it helps us shape our future and our next podcasts. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.